Good evening and welcome to Authors Interviewing Authors, where we feature two of our Apprentice House Press authors interviewing each other to learn more about their background, their writing, and their books. But before I turn it over to the true talent, our authors, a few words about Apprentice House. First, we have two missions at Apprentice House. We publish great work by amazing authors, and we provide an incredible learning experience for our undergraduates at Loyola University who are learning about editing, marketing, and designing books. And more, you can buy our books. Visit apprenticehouse.com and use code STREAM for 20% off all purchases. So now that the plug is out of the way, I would like to turn it over to that aforementioned true talent. Let me bring to the screen Mike Fiorito, and if I can find the right button to push, Maria Giura. Welcome, both of you. I'm clicking all the buttons, all the wrong buttons, like it's my first time. So, thank you both for being on, and we look forward to hearing more about both of you. So, cheers.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and thanks for sponsoring this. It's a lot of fun. So, Maria, I loved your book, Celibate. I have to say it was riveting. Dealt with a lot of real issues, things like faith, commitment, self-discovery, and I even gave it to my mother, by the way. And like you said to me, you said what your father said. It's okay you wrote it. I think that was your father, right? It's okay you wrote it. Just
Yes.
don't tell anybody.
Just don't tell anybody. Correct.
Maybe you could start us off with read a little something so that folks who've joined can get a little context if they haven't already read the book or bought the book. Would that be okay?
Sure. That'd be fine, Mike. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to Taylor and to Sarah and to Kevin from Apprentice House Press. I think it's so amazing that they're giving authors an opportunity to chat with each other about our work and also about writing in general. So I'm so happy to be here.
Yes.
And Mike, we only saw each other in person once at an Italian American Writers Association reading. So I know that we got back in contact after that one meeting when both our books were published by Apprentice House Press. So that's also a nice, that's nice that's the way we got back in contact with each other.
It connected, and I'm only, that was only a few years ago, but I've aged about 25 years because of COVID. But you look great.
Oh, that's probably only the way you feel, Mike. Only the way you feel. So sure, I will read a short excerpt. Mike and I agree that we like to leave, that less is more. So I'll read about a 3.5-minute excerpt from chapter 4 of Celibate, and the chapter is titled Courting. At this point, I'm calling Father James Infanzi, who's one of the main characters in the book. I'm calling him James. The first time I say his name in this excerpt, I'll say Father James, and then after that, I'll just say James. It's the same character. I don't want to confuse anyone, and I don't think I have to explain anything else. I didn't realize how much my relationship with Father James was hurting me, or just how much I resented him, until the day of my niece Nicole's christening. The party was at a rustic, upscale restaurant that was filled with the aroma of artichokes and tulips. My father came, but left early, before the cake, like he always did. Our interactions limited to a hello and a goodbye, him brusquely brushing the side of his cheek against mine with no hug. When my sisters and I were small, he was demonstrative, holding us high in his arms, cupping our faces tightly in his hands, rolling around with us on the living room carpet like we were sons. I'd have to brace myself, but at least I had him close. Once he and my mother separated, his embraces diminished. When my sisters and I were old enough to have our periods, he didn't touch us at all, except for the occasional headlock. Now I was lucky to get "Ciao, Bella," and "How are you?" which I always answered, "Fine, Baba," even if I wasn't. I'd learned early not to say much. As soon as any one of us tried, he cut us off. Like that day I tried to explain how anxious I was about starting first grade. I was sitting on his lap in my yellow robe and Buster Brown slippers, dipping a corner of my toast in his espresso. As I opened my mouth to tell him, he interrupted to complain to my mother about something, the rising price of pinoli nuts, or the old man who came in to buy one sfogliatelle, the most complicated and expensive pastry to make. When he was finally quiet for several seconds and I thought he might listen, I opened my mouth, but he saw the clock, jumped up from his chair, and I almost went flying again. Janine was the godmother, the absolutely natural and deserving choice since she was the oldest, but I felt left out, even though Julie gave my niece Nicole the middle name Maria and dressed her in my baptismal dress and bonnet. I thought having James near me would help, but it only made matters worse. The part that was most unbearable was when Julie asked him to take a picture with Nicole. He faced her to the camera, scooping one arm below her and the other around her belly, as my ivory gown draped over his arm like a bride's train. Nicole's face was a squarish dimple version of her father's, with her small jowls plumping onto the dress, the closest I had to a little person who shared my DNA. It was at that moment, with him smiling wide and my niece's head resting in his collar, that the grief shook me. I'd spent the last 6 weeks fantasizing the two of us married. Now to see my niece in his arms, where our daughter might have been had things been different, had it not been for our callings, for God's will, was awful. It was as if I was watching a movie about everything I was giving up, and I just gotten to the worst part. My tears started so quickly that I ran to the bathroom, where I locked myself for as long as I could get away with. When I returned to the table of honor, seated next to James, the keyboardist began playing Impossible.
Oof.
Like,
Wow. Just a couple of questions there. You said, was that Sfogliatelle? Did you say it differently?
Sfogliatelle? I
Yes.
said
Oh,
it
no,
the
no. Okay, you said it. How did you say it?
Sfogliatelle.
Oh, okay, maybe you probably say it the right way. I probably say it the wrong way. Yeah, but very powerful with the bride's dress. Oh my gosh, the way you described that. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, this was no doubt a hard book to write, Maria. Um, what would you say? What do you think this book did for you in writing it?
Um, so let me just start with one of my favorite quotes that the novelist Graham Greene said when he was asked, "Why did you write your autobiography, A Sword of Life?" And he said that he was trying to make some order out of chaos.
Hmm.
And I always remembered that. That just stayed with me. In retrospect, Mike, I that's what I was doing. I was trying to make some order out of chaos, but that's not what initially my motivation was. Like I
Hmm.
didn't that's not what I thought. And then I went to the page. I just had this story in me that probably would have never let go of me if I didn't get it on the page and finish it. I think that was really the initial impulse. And I think that there were just some personal stories that won't go away
Hmm.
until we write them down. Um, it helped me to figure out the truth. I went to this book, the initial writing of it, with no answers, more questions than answers. And eventually, over all the years of writing and rewriting it, um, I figured out more about myself and my motivations. Why did I
Hmm.
fall in love with a Catholic priest? Why this particular priest? And why
Hmm.
did we have such a hold on each other for so
Hmm.
long? So writing it helped me get to the other side of my own story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I see. I can completely relate to that. I think that it's not that we write to for looking for catharsis, but we do get catharsis. I don't, because I don't necessarily write for catharsis, or maybe I do and I'm not aware of it. So
Mm.
I can completely relate to that. And it's such a, as I've said to you, it's such a hot potato thing, and in reading it, sometimes it was intense. Um,
Yeah.
and then the subject of memoir. I mean, you could have chosen to write this as purely just a fictional story, but you chose memoir,
Mhm.
and which is a particular, there's perhaps constraints to that. I guess two questions. Why did you choose to write it as a memoir? And to having written things that are memoirish, did that create problems for you? And what kind of problems did they create?
Okay. Um, if I could have gotten away with fictionalizing it, um, I would have. And I dabbled in that for a little while. But for me, the most natural way of writing the story in the end was to write it as memoir and to stand behind it as memoir. Um, Fiction didn't seem like my strength. Um,
Mm,
and I think to this day, it's probably not my strength. So the writing didn't feel authentic when I tried it
mm,
out. I did give it a shot, not for very long,
right.
because I think I knew early on the the best way for me to write this particular story is to write it as memoir, because I know that there are plenty of people who take autobiographical material and make it fictionalized, even either in its entirety or partially, and they do it really well. They do it really
Hmm.
well. I didn't feel I was doing it well. So
Mm,
I didn't want to compromise the quality of writing in order to
mm,
get the story across, just to kind of play it safer for myself.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
And just as a follow-up question to that is, so I've written things that are memoirish, that are, they're based on things that have happened. And one of the things, and I think I'm hearing, is the use of I, the subjective. That's super important, to put yourself, and we as the reader see you, whether or not it's the true you or it's the narrative you. Um, you could have had that out, right? Too, to write it in that fashion, and to just say I, me, but fiction.
Hmm.
So is that something that you ever thought about afterwards or before, to
Um,
to write it as I, as memoir, but then just call it fiction, change the names?
so all the names are changed. So that's a good
Right.
point to just bring up. All the names are
Yeah.
changed. Everybody except myself. um, I yes, I did. I did think about it.
Yeah.
That also, and actually, Mike, I got asked that question because the first draft of Celibate was my dissertation at SUNY Binghamton, because you have the
Mhm.
option of a traditional dissertation or a creative dissertation. So Celibate was the very first draft of it, was a dissertation, and somebody asked me that afterwards in when there was a Q&A. And for me, that also didn't feel authentic. And
Mm,
that's not a comment on somebody else, another author's choice to
sure.
write it as memoir and then just call it fiction. I think it's a very personal choice. And I felt that for me, I needed to stand behind the fact that this was my story and it is memoir. And I think sometimes for the reader, it's very helpful that the reader knows, oh, okay, this author is saying this happened to her or
Hmm.
happened to him. I think that there's value in that
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah.
So yes, I thought of all those things. I thought of
Yeah.
every possible scenario other than the one I ultimately chose.
Right. Right. Because
um,
no matter what we write, people will say, was that your experience? Is they kind of seem to think that the writing voice is still you, even though there always has to be a layer between the writing and the experience, as much as we may try to get close to it.
that's so true. That's so true. People, right, want to still know how much of this actually
All
happened
right,
via
right.
fiction. Yeah, yeah. And then to answer your other question about, memoir, I think it is a problematic genre.
Hmm.
I have found it problematic in two ways, and I think we had like a very animated conversation about this over the phone once, Mike. The
Hmm.
first way is that the main artistic liberty that I took in Celibate is the way that I chose to write my childhood and my family's dynamic, especially from my younger years. I focused on the shadow side,
Hmm.
my father's emotional absence, my parents' marriage, the ways that I felt left out in my family, which I touch on in the excerpt that I just read.
Hmm.
I chose that because it connects thematically to my draw to Father Infancy.
Hmm.
It really does. So so it's the truth, but it's not all of it. I
Sure.
didn't I didn't
Sure.
write about the levity. There was a lot of happiness and fun and intimacy in my family growing up. I didn't
Hmm.
write that part. And so the problem then was that people who read the book who know me were they were scandalized not just by the scandal, you know, that I had that in some ways
Sure.
that was a little peripheral, not for everybody, but the fact that oh, I didn't know that you struggled that much, and it made some
Right.
people very quiet.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, and then the second way is that I think you might, I'm sure you understand this in some way, especially because we just said that people try to read memoir, even in fiction, is that once the book was done and published, I had processed the whole story. It was old news for me. It's never
Right.
old news for the reader.
Right.
It's always new news. They're reading it in the literary present. So that was an odd, even though I understood it, I understood they're reading something that they didn't know about. It was an odd experience to be the
Hmm.
person who's done with the experience. And now other people are reading it like it's happening to you now, even though they know it happened in the past. So
Right.
that was strange and it was problematic for the reader. I know there were people who had a hard time, who know me, who had
Yeah.
a hard time with it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I've had families say, well, when you write about stuff, you only write about the hard stuff. And I just said, well, I think we talked about, Tolstoy said, every family's happiness is the same. It's the tragedies that are different. It's very hard to write happiness. You know, I mean, it's possible.
Mhm.
Um, would you say that that your, in terms of subject matter of the book, your relationship with the priest, is that, you know, is that the is that relationship the only subject matter of the book? And I'm saying that kind of knowing that, knowing something of the answer.
Right, right. No, but it definitely dominates it. It definitely dominates the book, as you know. But no, it's not the only subject matter. The subject matter, I think, is a trifecta of fathers: my
Mm,
father, my natural father, priest father, and God the Father. And so, and my shifting relationships with all three of those fathers,
mhm,
and my drama and struggle with all of them. Um, One of the main subject matters is actually my distrust of God. Um, I didn't realize it in writing the book. I realized that I had been walking around for a long time with and I a distorted image of God. God is distant and detached, even as a taskmaster. And I think those characteristics were not unconnected to some of my father's characteristics.
mhm.
My father worked himself to the bone. He had a complicated relationship with my mother, and some of that carried over to my idea of God. So I would say that that's also really important subject matter um,
Mhm.
in the book as
Yeah,
well.
like you had from the reading, you kind of draw from your father and your father's embraces, and then we get to James. So
Yeah.
there's, you can see that thread carry over.
Hmm.
Um, what do you hope to convey to readers? What do you hope they walk away having read the book?
Um, so I think, Mike, maybe you feel this way as well. First and foremost, I hope a reader gets what they need and want from
Mm,
any book, right? I mean,
sure.
I hope that that's the transaction between the reader and a narrative, that even if they're not aware of what it is that they need or they want, that they wind up with it at the end. So that's first and foremost. With that said, I do have some ideas of what I hope it conveys. The first thing is that I hope that it shows that it's possible to live a fulfilled life as an uncoupled person. Um, I don't think that any of us is meant to be alone. But I don't necessarily think that you need to have, or that everybody needs to have a significant other to find joy and purpose and also connection and community. But I struggle to believe that. That's like, I think that's a lot of the narrative is me struggling to believe, oh, can I be fulfilled uncoupled? And so I hope that I'm a reliable narrator, because I really doubted that for a long time. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I hope that another thing I'm trying to get across is that there's some value to guarding our hearts. I don't mean being guarded. I mean that there's some value to letting relationships, especially romantic relationships, unfold in their own time. Like when you feel like your heart can be at home with somebody, when you trust someone, when you feel at peace with them. Because I think maybe especially for women and maybe especially for younger women, that like if you compromise something that's, relationships are all about compromise. But if you compromise something that really, really matters to you for a lover, I don't think it winds up working out well in the end. It may not be catastrophic, but I think it kind of chips away at the heart in some way. And so if Celibate could be at least in part a cautionary tale, I hope that's not all it is, but if can be a cautionary tale about how to avoid heartache, or at least to identify heartache, that would be wow. That would be wow if that could happen. And then I guess maybe a third thing is that we can make it to the other side of our spiritual struggles, especially the big ones. That even though it's very human to feel alone at times, I think ultimately we're never alone, even though that's exactly what we might feel like at times.
Yeah,
So,
no, you do convey that struggle, and it's multi-leveled. And I'll get to some of that a little later. Just the struggle with being ourselves and revealing, some of the things that in being ourselves, maybe it's a struggle to be honest about. So that was one of the really strong things I liked about the book. But I'll ask that in a little bit. So your first book, What My Father Taught Me, a collection of poetry, does it have a connection to Celibate? And if so, what is that?
yes, unintentionally. And actually, it was funny because What My Father Taught Me was a surprise. Like, I didn't realize I had a book of poems in me, and I didn't think they were going to get published before Celibate, but there it was. So it was like an extra gift. Yeah. So some of the poems, not all of them, are about my father's emotional absence. He was a workaholic, as I already mentioned. He's an Italian immigrant who learned from his father, not like all Italian immigrant men, but like some of them, that to show tenderness and love makes a man weak. And so the poems are about me grappling with that, but also coming to a certain level of acceptance and knowing that my father, did the best he could. So there's that connection to Celibate, definitely. And I definitely take more risks in Celibate than I do in What My Father Taught Me, but the poems are also honest in that collection. And then just as a quick aside, there are a lot of what I would call love poems in What My Father Taught Me, love poems to the divine and love poems also to Brooklyn. I grew up in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. So I write about like how I loved growing up in a neighborhood where the church and stores were named after legends, like St. Bernadette's Shrine Church and Joe Torre's Sports Shop and Mona Lisa Bakery. So it's a compilation. But I would say my father, as it's in the title, is a thread through both books.
Right. I was going to say it's almost like what it could have been the title for both books,
Mm,
on some level.
on some level, yeah.
There's our Father kind of implicit in there. Um, Interesting.
Yeah.
And what I was alluding to before, I love the fact that you're continuously calling yourself out in the book, and you're looking in the mirror, you're making sure you look good, and there's uh, the insecurity that we all feel. Um, it was What was that like for you as a writer to convey that, and why did you take that path?
Well, I think it was a risk too, because I was such a self-conscious younger woman. I really was so self-conscious.
Mm,
And so to actually get that self-consciousness on the page and admit to it also made me self-conscious. Like while I was writing, and I'm like, do you really want to put this out there? There were a lot
yeah.
of other things other than, in addition to the relationship with the priest, there were a lot of other things I was embarrassed to own up to on the page. But I think it was important because it just showed another level of tension to this. Here I am, I'm in love with the priest, but I'm also feeling a religious calling of my own. And yet, in the midst of that calling, I still want to look good. I still want to get my hair done. I still want this man's attention, this man I'm not supposed to have. So, wow.
Yeah.
I think I included it because it really adds to the tension
Hmm.
of the story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
some of my favorite stuff in the book. Just like checking lipstick and the shoes and all of that. It just kind of, because it rung true. So
Mm.
I thought that was interesting. And I grew up Catholic. I went to a Catholic school. Why does the Catholic Church, and especially still now, require celibacy?
Sure, I will definitely. And then I'm thinking maybe right after that, Mike, will start to shift to
Oh
you.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I'm
sure,
really
sure,
looking forward to
sure.
to asking you about falling from trees. Yeah. Um, so the first thing I just want to say about that, because that could be a very long topic, but I'll keep it short, is I think there's this misconception that the Catholic Church came up with celibacy. And for me, it's very helpful to know, no, Jesus did. Jesus came up with celibacy. He tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, some have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and whoever can accept this ought to accept it. So it seems to me that Jesus is saying, if you can't accept celibacy, okay, but those who can, in other words, those who are called to it, should. Um, and I feel in my heart he would never tell someone you ought to if he didn't first. So I know
Mm,
there's sometimes there's some question out there, was Jesus even celibate? I really believe he was, because I don't believe he would call other people to something that he didn't first. And we have it in scripture
mm,
that he didn't first live. So I think celibacy can be a very bad idea for some people, somebody who's choosing it to run away from something, who's afraid of their own sexuality, who's trying to hide something.
hmm.
And we've seen this in the nightmare of the
Sure.
sex abuse scandal in the church. Um, for someone for whom it's a true calling, who's really, really discerned it, really has turned it over in their mind, who's going into the life for the right reasons, I think it's a beautiful way to live a life. It's not the only way. Marriage and family are a beautiful way to live a life, but I think that it
Hmm.
could be a beautiful way to live a life. And I'll just end by saying this on the topic. Father Benedict Rochelle, who's a popular Franciscan priest and author, since passed away, he said, for anybody who's discerning between a celibate life or married life, they really should understand just how beautiful both are. Because in
Hmm.
order to choose something good, you have to understand the value in both of them in order to make a good choice. Seeing one of them as inferior to the other is not a real choice then. Because then it's like, well,
Hmm.
then I'll pick the superior one. I'm not going to pick an
Sure.
inferior. Right. So that always stayed with me.
Mm.
Is wow. Like for me, he kind of nailed it with that comment and
Yeah.
that truth, I think.
Yeah, and I,
Yeah.
I there are so many ways to express spirituality. Um, and for someone else to tell someone else, this is how you must express. If you can authentically come to your expression of spirituality, I think that's a high goal and achievement.
Amen.
Um,
Amen. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah. So actually, I think that's a great segue, Mike. Spirituality, and I'm just finally looking forward to asking you about Falling from Trees, your newest book, published in February.
Yes,
And
yeah,
yeah,
it's
right.
brand spanking new. Yeah.
Yes. And what I loved about it was that I was pleasantly surprised in the sense that I'm not a science fiction enthusiast. And I thought it might have been a book for science fiction enthusiasts, but for me, it feels like it reaches and appeals to such a broader audience that I was just overjoyed reading it. And I was wondering, was this intentional on your part? Um, or was it how the stories naturally came to you? That they're science fiction like, but they're not
Mhm.
so highly science fiction, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. It does, and thank you. So full disclosure, I've always loved science fiction, but I wasn't necessarily trying to write a science fiction book. Um, I think for me, I was trying to ask questions. So that was my main thing, and not to necessarily give answers. I was a philosophy major undergrad. A lot of the stories, they really begin with a question for me. What is consciousness? Um, I mean, they kind of become science fictional. Uh, are there ways to travel, to time travel, or to travel enormous distances that aren't necessarily with machines? Um, is emotion a vehicle of travel, or of course, our imagination? For me, I was thinking my I would say models were folks like Italo Calvino. More, it's kind of literary science fiction, or
Mm,
Jorge Borges. That's really more of what I was going with. But like you, I also was. Many of the stories are struggling with notions of belief. What do I believe? What is spirituality? What is the potential? What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of human life? So I think I try to explore these questions. I kind of begin with a question. And what I found is I was placing stories in different publications. And at some point you say, I have a collection here. I
mm,
should write more stories that kind of adhere to this theme I'm going for. So to
mhm.
answer your question.
Wonderful. And I just want to promise anybody who's watching or listening that you're also going to read an excerpt at
Yeah,
some
I'm going to
point.
read it next.
Oh,
I,
okay,
I
great.
I I thought it was great that you started off with a question just to give some context.
Hmm.
Um, so this story, it's about 3 minutes. It's called The Purest Rain, and it's written in first person, but it's not a memoir. I once was. We once were ordinary people like you. Being together, we have become one mind. I'm sorry if our writing is clumsy. We don't speak, write, or use words any longer. Our thoughts are felt by each other before we have them. The ideas of I and we aren't as clear as they may be for you, our ancestors. We are all we. We are all I. I am writing it to you as if we were I, so that my message could be understood. We have been sending our message to you in the form of rain, wind, and dreams. We understand that you can't hear us. So we write this letter of love to you. We hope you will read it. When we left the earth, our crew was young. We were sent in the wild hope of finding another hospitable world. The earth's climate spiraled into instability. The polar ice caps melted to unrecoverable levels, making the oceans pour onto the coasts, crushing cities, engulfing countless lives. There were hurricanes and storms. The skies had become hellfire. I volunteered. What was left for me? Our precious world was on the verge of collapse. I never felt that I belonged anyway. I vaguely recall the person who I was, a young scientist and a restless seeker. I was a loner, awkward, incapable of having relationships. I was more content in the computer lab than in the company of people. I had hoped to escape the Earth, to go as far away from humanity as possible. I didn't realize I'd be heading smack into the center of humanity itself. We left our family, our friends, and lives on the green and blue planet. We were hurled out into space, tossed like a message in a bottle. The moment we launched into space, I felt even my name slipping away. Seeing the Earth transform into a distant dot was like watching my own mind vanish. It saddened me to think that everything I'd ever known, every place I'd ever been, would be gone forever. And though I had a pang in my stomach, I also felt exhilarated. Everything would be out there now, beyond this world. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit
Mhm.
and just get to the end here. After traveling more than 400 light years, the Earth then only a memory, like an ancient myth of our past, we began to shuck off our genetically modified bodies. Our minds, like vines in a peaty moss, wound and tangled into each other. Where one mind ended, another began. Imagine never being alone, never feeling completely empty. All our emotions touched. Where someone had previously felt alone or frightened, the others anticipated these feelings and rushed to them. The speed of thoughts and feelings reached a rapid pace. Conversation between people were heard by everyone. Knowledge that one person had was shared. Learning became learning for everyone. Our bodies remained but were vacated. Our minds, like wind, swarmed into each other. Things like shame disappeared. At some point, even our spaceship slipped off us like a nightgown. We didn't need any longer. We traveled in unison, beyond light speed, in something we call forever now. We are everywhere at all times. And I'll actually stop right there.
Okay. All right. I'm glad you chose that one, Mike. And I actually just want to hold up the book because it's also such
Oh,
a
thanks.
beautiful cover. I was reading along as you were
Thank you.
writing it. And I'm glad you chose this story because so the Purest Rain, right? I want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah.
Yes. So you write about those who were called away for intergalactic travel. And you write, quote, their being together became together being. You also write that they became, quote, invisible ghosts swarming around those they left behind on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Have the rest of it here. With them in all their sadness, fear, and joy. So my question about this story, and also I think your other story, Tomorrow's Ghost,
Mm-hmm.
this is the way I read it. The story seems to me to be about this veil between the worldly and otherworldly, the mortal and immortal. And were you aiming to tell a story of how the souls who have gone before us are still with us?
Mm.
Did that just happen? Am I reading too much into it?
Well, no, I mean, I think I'm inviting everyone to read into it. It's this, unlike some of the stuff that you've read and I've written, like Call Me Guido, which is very narrative and very in the muck of life, real life, and sometimes in the dirty, ugly muck of it. This is really what I'm writing about, is the potential evolution of consciousness. So I'm sort of positing, we, especially in Western European American culture, we're so I-centered. What's in it for me? What do I get? And I think I'm looking out beyond that into what is it? What would it be like if we could collectively emote and feel, and our empathy, we led with empathy,
Mm.
And that empathy can extend to, of course, it should begin with people, but it shouldn't end there. Could it extend to animals? Could it extend to rivers and trees? So, and also there's the notion of, say, time travel, that the past, present, and future can be kind of, there are portals to, or is there even is that just a perceived barrier in our own mind? Is there a state of consciousness or evolution that we get to that we can see beyond that veneer?
Mm.
So that's at least what I was thinking. That was one of the themes. Falling from trees. The title. People say, what does that mean? Falling from trees. Well, the primates coming down from the trees into the savannas. Science. The apple. Newton's apple falling from the tree. So they're kind of exploratory pieces. If that
Mhm.
answered your question, or just drove it so far out into
No,
outer
not at
space.
all. Not at
Okay.
all. What I loved about the book, Mike, is that there's such a compassionate tone to it. Like after reading it, there's a very hopeful feeling. And one of the things that I really liked about it is that it gives sentient beings their rightful place in the universe. Um, uh, and shows how their sensitivity helps to catapult them into roles where they could, to quote, I think the story you just read, to quote it, to find solutions for our precious world on the verge of collapse.
Hmm.
And talk, brought up that quotation about chaos, making some order out of chaos. I think your book is doing that too. Um, can you speak to why it was important to you to get this across to readers that sensitive beings are the ones who should be the ones in roles of helping this precious world on the verge of collapse?
Yeah, it's funny. So I wrote the book, and then I started to do. I've been doing interviews and writing profiles on indigenous subjects, and meeting and talking to indigenous people, mainly American indigenous. And there are concepts and ideas that it's I'm hearing and learning about, that it seems like I was trying to write about in my book. Now that's, of course, I'm reading these after I'd read the book, but notions of things like, there's an Apache saying, when we show respect for other living things, they show respect for us. And
Mm,
that's just not people. I mean,
right.
people, you would assume that's the beginning point, the most relatable thing. Um, I love the notion of, there's a Haudenosaunee notion. It's 7 generations, and what we do we should think about how its impact is 7 generations.
Mm,
And
mhm,
for Western, Americans, this is such a crazy idea. But more than just being a nice thing, we're now realizing how urgent that is.
yeah.
So these notions that perhaps they weren't seen as logical, or the Western people that were encountering indigenous people, uh, they looked down on these notions, but they were really way more advanced, in my opinion. And so what I'm positing, it's not this high moral thing that I myself, I mean, I'm, weak and flawed and make tons of mistakes, and can be materialistic, like anyone else, but I'm positing an aspirational hope.
Mm, mhm.
So, if that answered your question.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how did you decide on the order of the stories, or was it so much a decision? Was it instinct,
Mm.
suggestions from our publisher, some narrative order?
Well, the stories were written independently until maybe I got to like the fifth one, and then said, I have something, I'm doing something here. So I really tried to just place them in a way that would that would hopefully create some narrative arc. I'm not sure if I
Mhm.
achieved that, because it's when we get to the end, the last story, it's it's a little bit poking fun at our inability to be good, good creatures on this planet, good shepherds on this planet. Um, so not exactly sure,
Mhm.
but I did write them and say, okay, let's see how does this flow. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, I think the fact that I didn't stop and think about it means that it worked for me. Do you know,
Hmm,
like there wasn't
awesome.
too much thought about it. It just, yeah, it just went into the next story. Um, so the book has gotten a lot of good critical reviews, and one of the advanced praise of the book that stood out to me was from Chad Frame.
Mm,
He said that what's fantastic about Falling from Trees aren't the elements of the fantastic, but rather what the stories show us about relationships. And I couldn't agree more. I
mm,
really think that that says it so well. I enjoyed the themes in the book. For example, how competition and ambition and success can be a tremendous burden that we put on
hmm,
ourselves or that's put on us. In your story, everybody's perfect, nobody's human.
hmm.
Um, do you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between the fantastical and the quote commonplace
Sure.
that you've woven together in the collection?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think the truth is it's a memoir. No, just kidding. But they are based. You'll see there are things that come from uh, uh, you know experiences that as a father, there's conversation almost taken verbatim with my son,
Mm,
and it's I think it's I'm forgetting. I think it's Tomorrow's Ghost, or um, it's the one where it's the father, the son kind of travels back in time, and he's studying to be, well, his mother's a climate scientist, um, and but I guess what I'm saying is many of the stories are really disguised domestic stories,
mhm,
and what I was truly going for is exactly that, was the relationships, the emotions, because ideas are, that's nice. Thank you. Thanks for the nice idea. But if you don't connect it with real people and sentiment, it may fall flat.
mhm,
Um, it's funny because, one of the criticisms I got, one of the negative criticisms, was that the stories were too short. And really, that was kind of, it was intentional to keep the story short. If you've
mhm,
read Jorge Borges, he has a two-page story. Now, it's Jorge Borges, so he includes the whole universe in them, and
mhm.
in thousands of years of human history and literary history. Of course, I'm aspiring to do that. Um, so I'm glad that's maybe the most exciting thing to read, is that people connected with them as stories and not robots and spaceships and all that kind of stuff. Um,
Right. And I think and I felt so connected to them for that reason, for that reason, because it was the fantastical and the relationships aspect of it. Um, I'm not sure if you already answered this one, Mike, but did you feel that this book was always in you to write on some level, or did the impulse to write it emerge more recently?
mm. Oh, I'd say that as a younger person, I probably had these stories in me first, and then
Hmm.
as I started writing more, I started to really confront more hot potato subjects. Um, and then after writing a whole lot of that kind of stuff, I actually wrote two books at the same time. I wrote Falling from Trees, and there's something coming out called The Hated Ones, which is about gang violence and growing up in tough, rough and tumble New York City in the 70s. So these were being written side by side.
Mm.
Um, but I think that the younger me these stories reflects the kind of looking up at the stars, wondering about life, kind of
Mhm.
that there's a fundamental me that, yeah, is what I would have written. If you look at my kindergarten writing, it's probably more like this. And I
Okay.
don't mean that as a putting myself down. I mean it's just how my mind works and what has attracted me as subject matter and so on.
Hmm. I just going back to the story, everybody's perfect, nobody's human. I also really appreciated that story because I think that so many people can relate. Um, because he's an employee in this very very large company, and there's this big conference, and he makes himself sick, right? I mean, this is the way the
Yeah.
story ends. He gets himself to the point of being sick from the level of competition and stress.
Hmm.
um and so I think that that's something that a lot of people can relate to on some level,
Hmm.
on some level.
Yeah, I mean that
Yeah.
that comes from real stuff.
Yeah.
But and it's funny, the title, it was something a girlfriend said. She got it wrong. She was trying to say, nobody's perfect, everybody's human, and she said that, and that stuck with me for that I had to be 16 or so, 17. So I loved that phrase, and I hope no one's ever used it before.
Uh-huh.
But it seemed to fit very very perfectly with the theme of that story.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, what I liked, Mike, a lot of times people will say, it's so hard to write a book length story because the narrative arc is so long and everything. I admire being able to write shorter pieces and be able to accomplish a narrative arc in a shorter amount of space. I mean, that's maybe down the road I will try my hand at that
Mm.
and try to write the other side of my childhood, the side that I didn't write, in Celibate. So actually your book is also an inspiration to me to maybe try out something different.
Well, it's funny you say that. I had a teacher. He was pretty well known, William Packer. He's a poetry teacher in New York City, and he's a kind of funny guy. His behavior and gestures, and he would say, "Just get out of it." When you're writing a poem, just get out of it. Get finished before you mess it up.
Mhm.
And
So
which is a
true.
funny, that he had a very dramatic way of saying it, but just it's like you want to run from it. um but I think you and I, we actually, there was, in thinking about it, we were after a lot of the same subject matter. We're both writing about the ineffable, things that can't be reduced by science. um what's the theme of climbing trees is the meek shall inherit the earth.
Hmm.
And there's also that, there's frankly, there's the struggle of faith, there's the struggle in belief, which we express very differently. You express in a very directly personal way,
Hmm.
whereas I'm sort of disguising it, and I don't mean that negatively. I mean, I'm putting it on a fictional plateau, um, uh, whereas you're going smack right into it.
Hmm. Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
I think
I
is what I said, is I tried to escape humanity and went smack right into it.
hmm. Yeah. No, I agree with those points of similarity. And I think I like them because it's not obvious.
Mhm.
It's after reading the books and thinking about them. Those similarities are there.
Like the chapter you have, Mystic.
Hmm.
I love, and I forget what the title of the story is. It's the story that I wrote was about going to Lourdes and the
Yes.
epiphany that I have. But your epiphany about the nuns with the blue hats praying in front of the sacrament, and there were a lot of commonalities. Why do you think that? Why were we able to achieve that, having not discussed it before we wrote
It,
these things?
exactly. Exactly. And I had mentioned to you it's a small point, but there's a Saint Bernadette in your story.
Hmm.
That's where the narrator winds up going back to, is Lourdes, right? And the Our Lady of Lourdes appears to Saint Bernadette, and Saint Bernadette is where that first stirrings of religious calling I felt as a young person was in St. Bernadette's Church. So, small points of synchronicity
Yeah,
between us.
and I think you say that Infanzi was a sign for you to truly discover your spiritual calling.
Yeah.
And that's a funny way for it's the Dalai Lama says, the things that we hate the most are the things we learn the most from, like the thing we have the most fear of. And I think we both kind of touch on those things.
Yeah.
And
What's
there's,
interesting?
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, finish your thought.
I was just going to say, and why is that? Where do these synchronicities come from? I think, they're worth looking at. Uh, that's life is more than just the facts of science. Not that science isn't important and vital, but there's more to it than what we sometimes see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you, Mike. To bring this to others, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fun talking to you, and especially you, and thank you for thinking of me. And we have this kind of mystical connection that I'm sure it will continue and go on. So
Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
know if we want to invite Kevin back into. There he is.
Hello.
Hi,
Hey
Taylor.
there. Hey,
Thank
Taylor.
you both so much. You all were amazing, and just learning about your books and everything. I was like, this is so interesting. I loved it. But thank you to everyone that viewed for tonight. Again, a big shout out to Maria and Mike for having you being on this live stream. It was awesome. Don't forget to check out our website, apprenticehouse.com, and use our code STREAM for 20% off all of our purchases. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Taylor.
Apprentice House. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Kevin. Wherever you are.
Yes. Bye,
See
Kevin.
ya.